There once was a prince who made it his habit once a year to ride through his kingdom in disguise, because he wanted to know what life was really like for his subjects, and he knew if they knew it was him, they wouldn't tell him the truth. They would flatter him, the prince. So he would disguise himself, and he and his advisor would ride through the countryside dressed as merchants. On one of these rides, they had somehow lost their way and had traveled through the desert so long that they had no water left. And they traveled on beyond that point until they were certain that they would die. And just as they were giving up hope, one of them saw off in the distance a young woman at a well. Well, they both saw the young woman at the well then, but they decided it must be a mirage. They were seeing what they wished they could see, what they hoped they would see. But they rode towards that woman at the well, and she got larger and larger and more solid. She was real, a beautiful young woman just arriving, about to pull water up. And they rode up, and they said, water, please. And she turned and she looked at them, and she took the bucket of water that she had just pulled up out of the well. She walked towards them, and she threw it on their feet. What trick is this? They said. Oh, it is no trick, she said. We need water. We're parched. We're dying. She said, I know. And she turned back to the well, and she drew out another bucket of water. And she walked towards them. They reached for it, and she threw it on their feet. This is no time to play. What kind of a person are you? And with that, she drew a third bucket of water, walked over and handed them a ladle. And each of them drank his fill of that cold, cold water. And when they had rested a bit, they said, why did you do that? What a cruel thing to do to us at a time like that. She said, no. As hot as you were, as cold as that water was, if I had let you drink your fill of icy water when you were that hot, it would have killed you. I had to wait until you had cooled down a little. And they realized what a wise, wise young woman she was. Well, before they could find out anything about her, her name or anything at all, she turned and she walked away toward a little town. And the prince and his advisor followed into the town, and they talked to people as they customarily did. The prince tried not to let this girl be too much on his mind. It was just a chance that she was there. But they got back to the kingdom. He went back to his daily duties, and all he could think about was this girl. So he finally sent his advisor back. Find out who she is. Tell her that I wish to marry her. And the advisor rode back to the town and asked around until he discovered that she was the daughter of a weaver. He went to the weaver's cottage, a very small cottage, and when the door opened, it was hung with the most beautiful fabrics you've seen, silks of all colors that the weaver and his daughter had made. The man talked to the girl's father, explained the situation, and said that the prince would very much like to marry the girl. The father turned to his daughter, who was sitting in the shadows the whole time, and said, well, what do you think? And she said, does he know a trade? He's a prince. Of course he doesn't know a trade. Then I won't marry him. Are you mad? You're a weaver's daughter. You live in a hovel. You'll be here forever. You have the chance to live in a palace. It's good for everyone to know a trade. Fortunes come and fortunes go. And someday he may need to know a trade. Tell him that if he learns a trade, then I'll consider marrying him. So the advisor scratched his head and left. And when he got back to the palace and told the prince that she refused to marry him until he had learned a trade, well, that was crazy, but he was in love. So he decided that if she was a weaver of silken fabrics that perhaps he might learn to weave too. And he hired someone to come and teach him, but he decided he wanted to learn how to weave carpets. And he worked for hours and hours every day until he could weave some of the most beautiful carpets you've ever seen. And after a year had passed and he was to the point that he thought perhaps it would be enough to impress her, he sent his advisor back with one of his carpets. And when she saw it, the girl, whose name was Anait, looked at that carpet and said, "Take me back with you. I'll marry him now." So they were wed, and they were very, very happy together. But she didn't know how to read. Nobody knew how to read. And he would read to her day in and day out, read to her in the gardens, but she wanted to read for herself. So he agreed to teach her. And now she practiced for hours every day until she could read better than some of the most educated men in the kingdom. Over time, his father died, and the prince became king. And the king and his beautiful Queen Anait were very wise, and they ruled very well. And the king continued the habit that he had had as a young man of once a year traveling through the kingdom in disguise. And on one of these trips, he arrived in a town where people were talking about highwaymen who had been kidnapping people who were never seen again. This was very disturbing news. And as he and his advisors left the town, they had gotten just out of view. They were passing through an area with some very tall rocks when suddenly they were set upon by those very highwaymen. Now, being in disguise, the highwaymen thought they were only two merchants, didn't know it was the king and his advisor. And they wisely kept their mouths shut. They were put in chains and they were walked for miles to an old, abandoned mine. And when they reached the mine, the robbers said to them, "If you have a useful trade, we have a job for you. If you don't know a trade, you'll work in the mines until you're dead." The advisor didn't know a trade. But the king said, "I'm a weaver. I weave carpets." So they showed him into a room, a large, cavernous room filled with emaciated men who were chained to the tools of their trades. There were blacksmiths. There were wheelwrights. There were people of every trade you can imagine, but these men were chained to the tools of their trades, and they worked. They were skeletons at work. And the king looked around and he said, "I weave carpets, and I weave very good carpets. In fact, if you will bring me the materials I ask you to bring, I will weave a carpet so beautiful that I guarantee you Queen Anait herself will buy it, and she will pay you 10 times its worth." "Ha!" they said. "How can you make a guarantee like that?" "I know the queen," he said. "I have woven carpets for her before. I know her tastes." And so they brought to him all of the different colors of wool that he required, and he sat and he began to weave, and he wove for days and for weeks, with nothing to eat but an occasional crust of bread. And he, like the other men around him, became hollow-cheeked and hollow-eyed. But finally the carpet was done. And he called to the chief of the robbers, and he said, "The carpet is finished. I guarantee you Queen Anait will buy it. You should ask her 10 times its worth. She will pay it." And the robber looked at the carpet, and it was beautiful, but it was covered with all sorts of strange symbols. He couldn't make heads or tails of it, but if that was the queen's taste, all right. So he rolled up the carpet and he gave it to a messenger who carried it off to the palace. She heard that there was someone at the gate with a carpet. She'd been waiting for weeks for him to come home, but she hadn't until that moment realized anything was wrong, because sometimes he was gone for weeks. But when she heard someone was at the gate with a carpet for her, she invited the man in. He said, "Your Majesty, we have found such a fine carpet. We thought perhaps you might be interested." And he opened it out for her. And she stood and she looked at that carpet, covered with its strange symbols. And she read, "Kidnapped, hundreds starving in abandoned mine, captors heavily armed." She smiled. "It's beautiful," she said. "What do you want for it?" And he quoted a price that was 10 times its worth. And she turned to a lady in waiting and whispered something to the lady, who left the room. She smiled and continued to admire the carpet until the doors burst open and guards ran in and grabbed the man and carried him off in chains. And then Queen Anait herself ran down to the stables, took her husband's armor, put on his helmet, put on his breastplate, got on his fastest horse, roused their army, and she led the army out to the old abandoned mine. She knew just the place of which he was talking. They brought with them baskets and baskets of food for the men they knew were starving inside. And when they arrived, the robbers ran out, and they were heavily armed, but they were no match for Queen Anais and her army. And they took them down. And they went into the tunnels, and down in the tunnels of the mines, they found the men who had been put to hard labor mining, and there was the advisor, skeletal as the rest. And they gave them food, and the men gorged themselves before they ever even left the mine. And then they found that cavernous room full of skeletal tradesmen, and there was her husband, the king, chained to his loom. "I knew you would come," he said. They were all rescued. They all went and rejoined their families. And the king and his advisor went back with Anais to the palace. He, grateful that she had made him learn a trade, and she, grateful that he had taught her how to read. And they ruled on for many, many years, and wisely and well.